Wyoming Territory, January 1877, where the Snowhorn Mountains stood like silent giants, their peaks buried under snow that fell heavy and unforgiving. Silas Granger, a man of 39, rode his mare through the pines, the wind biting at his face sharp as a blade. 10 years ago, fever stole his wife Clara and their boy Samuel, leaving him with a cabin of logs, a heart turned hard as flint, and a silence that clung to him like frost. He'd grown used to it, the quiet, the way it filled the spaces where laughter once lived. His broad frame, hunched against the storm, carried the weight of a man who'd learned to trust little and speak less, his eyes scanning the world with the wariness of someone who'd seen it turn cruel. The blizzard roared, a beast tearing at the trees when a sound pierced the gale, a cry thin and brittle like a thread snapping. Silas pulled his horse to a stop, breath clouding in the freezing air, and tilted his head. There it was again, not the howl of a wolf or the snap of a branch, but something human, fragile, desperate. His first thought was to keep moving. The storm was no place for lingering, and he owed no one anything. But the cry came again, sharper, tugging at something deep in his chest, something he'd buried long ago. He dismounted, boots sinking ankle deep into the snow, his gloved hand resting on the knife at his belt. The trail wound through pines bowed under ice, leading to a clearing where a rotting fence post stood like a grave marker. And there, tied to it with barbed wire, was a woman. Her body slumped, her wrists raw and bleeding, her dark hair frozen in clumps against a face bruised purple and pale as death. Her lips cracked and bloodless barely moved, but her eyes half open held a flicker of life, fierce and fading. At her feet lay 3 bundles newborns wrapped in scraps of cloth so thin they might have been torn from a ghost's shroud. One wailed a weak, trembling sound. Another lay still, too still. The third, smaller, had skin white as moonlight, eyes gray and strange like storm clouds caught in glass. Silas froze his breath, catching not just from the cold, but from the sight of her, a woman beaten and left to die in a way that made his stomach lurch. He'd seen hardship, war, starvation men who'd kill for a bottle, but this was something else, something that clawed at the edges of human decency. His mind raced, and a shadow of doubt crept in. She was Apache. He could tell from the cut of her clothes, the braid that once held her hair now hacked away. The stories he'd heard in town, Apache raiders, savages untrustworthy, flashed through his mind. He'd grown up with those tales, warnings from men in saloons who spat the word Indian like a curse. For a moment he hesitated, the weight of those stories pressing against his instinct to help. What if she was trouble? What if her people came looking, bringing more than he could handle? But then the pale child stirred her tiny hand, twitching, and the cry came again, cutting through his doubt like a knife. He knelt, checking the babies. The crying one breathed shallow but steady, her chest rising under his touch. The quiet one was cold, her pulse faint, but there. The pale one, the strange-eyed girl, blinked up at him, her gaze pulling at something he couldn't name. He glanced at the woman, her face a map of pain, and the hesitation crumbled. Apache or not, she was human, and no one deserved this. "You're coming with me," he said, his voice rough as the gravel under his boots, not a question, but a decision. She blinked slow and heavy like she was grasping for a lifeline. "Don't let them take my girls," she whispered, her words barely audible over the wind's howl. Silas didn't answer, just pulled his knife and sliced the barbed wire, wincing as it tore free from her skin, blood welling in dark streaks. She didn't cry out, didn't flinch, just sagged against him, her body light as a husk, heavy with suffering. He caught her before she fell, his arms steady around her waist, her weight nothing compared to the years he'd carried alone. The babies he gathered next, tucking them inside his coat, their small bodies cold against his chest. The wind screamed, slicing through the clearing, but he shielded them, his frame a bulwark against the storm. His horse snorted, restless, as he mounted, cradling the woman in front of him, the infants nestled between them. "You don't die here," he muttered, Not to her, not to the babies, maybe to the mountains, or the God he hadn't spoken to in years. Not on my land. The ride to his cabin was slow, the snow deep, the trail uphill. His cabin, a squat box of logs with a slanted roof groaning under snow, stood dark against the ridge. Silas kicked the door open, carried her inside, and laid her on a pile of quilts near the hearth. The babies he set in a basket lined with rabbit pelts, their faint breaths a fragile rhythm in the quiet. He stoked the fire hands, moving with the sureness of a man who'd built a life from necessity, not choice. The room warmed the cold, retreating like a scolded dog. Through the night he worked without pause, silent but steady. He warmed goat's milk over the fire, testing it on his wrist, before spooning it into the babies' mouths. The crying one took it greedily, the quiet one slower, the pale one with a hesitance that knotted his gut. For the woman he dipped a cloth in warm water, cleaning the blood from her wrists and ankles where the wire had bitten deep. Her bruises ran deeper than the skin, purple black marks that spoke of rage, not her own. She stirred once, mumbling Joseph, hair, blizzard, white moon. The words were broken, feverish, but they carried a weight that made Silas's jaw tighten. Apache or not, someone had meant for her to die, and they'd meant it to hurt. By dawn, the fire burned steady. The cabin warmed the babies, sleeping, their tiny chests rising and falling. The woman's breathing was shallow, but even her face less pale but still drawn like a canvas stretched too tight. Silas sat by the hearth hands, finally still watching the snow fall outside, covering the tracks that led to her pain. He didn't pray, hadn't in years, but something in him hoped she'd live, hoped the girls would, hoped the world might spare them just this once. And yet in the back of his mind the old stories lingered, whispering that helping her might bring trouble he couldn't outrun. Days dragged on slow and heavy, the storm outside softening but never truly gone. Silas's cabin, once a place of silence broken only by the creak of wood or the wind's low moan, now held new sounds, the crackle of the fire, the soft whimpers of babies, the rustle of quilts as the woman stirred. Silas moved through his tasks with quiet purpose, splitting wood, boiling water, feeding the infants with a pine-carved spoon. He'd named them just to keep them straight, Ayana for the pale one with the gray eyes, Nita for the quiet one, Tallulah for the one who cried like she was demanding the world's attention. On the 5th day, the woman woke, her eyes clearer, but shadowed like a lake, hiding secrets in its depths. She lay propped on the quilts, her hands wrapped in linen strips, her dark hair loose and uneven, as if someone had taken a blade to it in anger. Silas was stirring milk over the fire when she spoke, her voice hoarse but steady. "I'm Maribel," she said. "Maribel Chiricahua Apache." He nodded, setting the spoon down. Silas. His name was all he gave, plain as the logs around them. She looked at the babies, her gaze lingering on Ayana, whose pale skin seemed to glow in the firelight. "They're mine," she said, not a claim, but a plea, as if she feared he might turn her away. He didn't. He handed her a tin cup of warm milk, his calloused fingers brushing hers, a fleeting touch that felt heavier than it should. Maribel sipped slowly, her hands trembling not from cold, but from memory. She spoke in fragments, her words like stones pulled from a riverbed, worn smooth, but heavy with time. "I was 17, she said, staring into the fire, its glow catching the edges of her face. "My father gave me to Joseph Quinn, a man with one foot in our world, one in yours. He had land horses, a name that carried weight. My family thought I'd be safe, thought I'd be lucky." Silas sat across from her, sharpening a knife against a whetstone, the slow scrape filling the silence. He didn't look up, but he listened, his face still as the mountains outside. The stories he'd heard about Apache people tugged at him again, tales of raids, of distrust, of a divide that ran deeper than the rivers. He'd never questioned them much, not until now, not until he saw her broken, but unbowed, and felt the weight of his own choices. Helping her wasn't just about saving a life. It was defying a world that told him she was less, that her kind were trouble. He pushed the thought down, but it lingered a splinter in his mind. He wanted sons. Maribel went on, her voice tightening like a bowstring. Sons to carry his name, his blood, his claim to the tribe. I gave him daughters. 3 girls, one after another. The first he tolerated. The second he cursed. The third... She paused, her eyes flicking to Ayanna, whose gray eyes blinked open, unseeing, but alive. When he saw her, he said I'd betrayed him. Said her skin, her eyes meant I'd lain with a white man. Called her a curse, a shame on his blood. Silas's hand stilled the whetstone quiet. He looked at her now, his gaze steady, but inside his thoughts churned. He'd heard of albino children, rare and strange, whispered about in towns as omens or oddities. Part of him, the part shaped by years of hearing men spit venom about Apache ways, wondered if there was truth to Joseph's claim, if she'd brought this on herself. But then he saw her hands scabbed and bruised, and the way she looked at Ayanna, not with shame, but with a love so fierce it could burn through snow. He pushed the doubt away, ashamed it had even crept in. "They cut my hair," she said, touching the uneven strands, her fingers lingering like they could still feel the blade's bite. "In my people, that's a death. They said I was no longer Apache, no longer anything. Joseph's brothers beat me, kicked me till I couldn't stand. Then he dragged me to that post, tied me with wire, left me and my girls to the snow. Said if the spirits wanted us, we'd live. Said it was justice." Her voice didn't break, but her hands clenched the cup, the tin denting under her grip. Silas stood slow and deliberate and pulled an elk fur cloak from a trunk. He draped it over her shoulders, the weight of it settling like a vow. She looked up, her eyes searching his, and for a moment he felt the divide again, the white man and the Apache woman, 2 worlds that shouldn't meet. But they had, and he'd chosen to act, not because it was right by some preacher's book, but because leaving her there would have made him less than the man he wanted to be. "Ayanna," she whispered, naming the pale one. "She's not a curse. She's moonlight. I prayed she wouldn't die for what she didn't choose." Her voice faltered, but no tears came. She'd spent them all, Silas figured, long before he found her. He crouched beside the basket, checking the girls. Nita stirred her tiny fist, curling against the pelts. Tallulah sighed, a sound like a bird settling into its nest. Ayanna's gray eyes met his, and that strange pull hit him again, like she saw more than a child should. He didn't name it, just tucked the blanket tighter around them and stood. "You're safe here," he said, the words plain but heavy like stones laid to build a wall. Maribel nodded, her face still, but her eyes alive with something new. Gratitude, maybe, or the first flicker of trust. Outside, the snow fell softer now, the storm easing, but the cold lingered, a reminder of how close death had come. Inside, the fire burned steady, and Silas Granger, a man who'd turned his back on hope, felt it stir again, small and stubborn like a seed under frost. But so too did the doubt, the fear that saving her might bring a storm he couldn't weather, not just from the cold, but from a world that saw her blood as a mark against her. Silas rose before dawn, as always, slipping out to check his traps, or hunt in the gray light, bringing back rabbits or grouse to stew with roots he'd dug from the frozen earth. He'd boil milk for the girls, spooning it carefully into their tiny mouths, watching their lips move with a hunger that reminded him they were fighters, just like their mother. Maribel, still weak, ate what he offered. Broth thickened with wild carrots, potatoes, mashed soft. Her hands trembling less each day. She didn't speak much, and neither did he. Their silence, a kind of understanding, like 2 people sharing a trail without needing to map it out. One morning, as Silas stoked the fire, he noticed Maribel's hand hover near her head, fingers twitching but never touching the uneven, hacked-off strands of her hair. He'd seen the shame in her eyes, the way she turned her face from the light, as if the loss of her braid was a wound deeper than the bruises on her skin. Among her people, he'd heard cutting hair was a kind of death, a casting out. He didn't know the full weight of it, but he saw how it hollowed her. Without a word, he rummaged through an old trunk, pulling out a wool scarf, faded blue and soft from years of use. He draped it over her head, tucking it gently around her shoulders, his fingers careful not to linger. Maribel's breath caught, and for the first time since he'd found her, tears spilled down her cheeks, silent and heavy, pooling in the cracks of her lips. She didn't speak, just clutched the scarf, her knuckles whitening, and Silas turned back to the fire, pretending not to see. Their days fell into a rhythm, quiet, but not empty. Maribel began to sit up longer, her strength returning like a slow thaw. One evening, as the fire cast shadows across the cabin's walls, she spoke, her voice soft but clear, like a stream finding its way through stones. "My people, the Chiricahua. We honor the land," she said, cradling Ayana, whose gray eyes blinked up at her. "We sing to it, pray for its children, for the mothers who birthed them. My mother taught me songs for daughters, not sons." Silas, mending a torn glove by the hearth, glanced up, his face still, but his eyes listening. She went on telling of blessings spoken at births, of lullabies that carried the weight of generations, her words weaving a world he'd never known. For the first time in years, a smile cracked his weathered face, small but real, like a spark catching kindling. That night, as Maribel slept, Silas sat at a rough table, a piece of cedar plank in his hands. His knife moved with care, carving letters with the same precision he used to skin game. Ayana, Nita, Tallulah. Each name took shape under his blade, the wood smooth and warm in the firelight. He hung the plaques above the basket where the girls slept their tiny breaths, a soft counterpoint to the fire's crackle. Maribel woke at dawn, her eyes catching the names before she fully stirred. She rose slow and unsteady, and touched each letter, her fingers tracing the curves, as if they held a promise no one else had ever made. "You wrote their names," she whispered, her voice breaking not with sorrow, but with something softer, something like wonder. Silas, stirring the fire, only nodded his back to her, but the air between them felt different, heavier, like the moment before a storm breaks. The cabin, once a place of solitude, had become a sanctuary, its walls holding not just warmth, but the beginnings of trust. Silas and Maribel moved around each other carefully, their silence not cold, but alive like roots growing beneath the frost. He didn't ask about her past, and she didn't offer more, but in the quiet acts, his scarf on her head, her stories by the fire, they found a language that needed no words. Outside, the snow still fell soft and steady, but inside the fire burned bright, and for the first time in a decade, Silas felt the weight of his loneliness shift, not gone, but shared. By March, the Snowhorn Mountains began to loosen their grip, the snow melting into gray slush that revealed patches of earth dark and stubborn beneath. The air carried a hint of warmth, a promise of spring that crept up the ridge like a cautious guest. Silas Granger's cabin, once a lonely outpost, now hummed with life, its hearth a steady heart, pumping warmth into the lives of Maribel and her 3 girls. Maribel, whose strength had returned like a river after drought, began to venture beyond the cabin, her steps slow but sure, her hands carrying bundles of herbs she'd dried in the Apache way, sage yarrow cedar bark tucked into a satchel Silas had patched for her. She started down the mountain first to the nearest settlement, a cluster of shacks and a trading post where folks eked out a living under the shadow of the peaks. She didn't speak of her past, didn't need to. Her hands told her story, mixing salves for a woman in labor, brewing teas for a child burning with fever, singing soft Apache lullabies to orphans in a makeshift shelter. The townsfolk, wary at first of the Apache woman with her scarred hands and uneven hair, began to seek her out, their whispers turning from suspicion to respect. Mother Snow. They called her a name born from the way she moved through their lives, quiet and steady, like a snowfall that softens the world's edges. Her girls, Ayana, Nita, and Tallulah, grew stronger by the day, their cries now full and bright, their cheeks plump with milk and warmth. Ayanna, the pale one, drew eyes wherever Maribel went. Her gray eyes and moonlight skin set her apart, and folks murmured, some calling her a spirit, others a curse. But when she smiled small and shy, even the hardest hearts softened. Moonlight Child. They named her a title that spread through the valley like a song. If that girl's a curse, an old trapper said, spitting tobacco into the dirt, it's one that makes you want to be better. Maribel never corrected them, just held her daughters close, their small hands curling into hers, their trust a shield against the world's judgments. Maribel's days were full, her hands always moving, stirring pots, binding wounds, teaching children to scratch letters on slate with bits of charcoal. The orphans, ragged and wary, began to linger after lessons drawn by her voice, which carried the cadence of Apache songs, low and haunting like wind through the pines. One evening, a girl no older than 10, her hair matted and her eyes too old for her face, slipped a crude necklace of braided grass into Maribel's hand. "For you, mother," she said, the word soft but heavy like a stone dropped into still water. Maribel's breath caught, and she tucked the necklace into her pocket, her fingers lingering on the rough strands as if they could hold the weight of her heart. Silas watched from a distance, his days spent hunting or mending the cabin, his hands busy, but his eyes often on Maribel. He saw the way she moved among the townsfolk, her head bowed, not in shame, but in focus, her hands steady as she worked. He saw the children trail her like ducklings, the way the old women nodded when she passed. He didn't speak of it, didn't know how. But each night when he returned to the cabin, he'd sit by the fire, a tin cup in his hand, his fingers tapping a restless rhythm against the metal. He'd look at the plaques he'd carved, Ayanna Nita Tallulah, and wonder when the cabin had stopped being just a shelter. When had it become a home? When had these strangers, this Apache woman and her girls, become something he couldn't imagine losing? One night as the fire burned low and the girls slept their tiny breaths, a soft chorus. Silas sat on the porch, sanding a board for a new shelf. Maribel stepped out, her scarf loose around her shoulders, her eyes catching the last light of the day. She sat beside him, silent at first, then spoke, her voice low. "You didn't have to do this," she said, gesturing to the cabin, the plaques, the life they'd begun to build. Silas paused, his hands stilling on the wood. "Didn't see no other way." He said his words plain, but carrying a weight that filled the space between them. She looked at him, her eyes searching, and for a moment the world was just the two of them, the fire's glow and the distant howl of the wind. "My people sing of the land," she said. "They say it chooses who stays, who belongs. I think it chose you for us." Silas didn't answer, just looked out at the darkening ridge, his heart heavy with something he hadn't felt in years. Hope, maybe, or the fear of it. He tapped his cup once, twice, then set it down, his hand brushing hers, not by accident, but not quite on purpose. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full, like the moment before a seed breaks ground, reaching for light. March 1877 wore spring like a thin shawl over winter's bones, the snow melting into rivulets that carved paths down the ridge, but the air still carried a chill that lingered in the shadows of the pines. Silas Granger's cabin stood steady, its logs weathered but unyielding, a small fortress against the world's cruelty. Inside the hearth glowed, casting warmth across the faces of Maribel and her 3 girls, Ayanna, Nita, and Tallulah, whose laughter now mingled with the crackle of the fire. Silas, a man who'd carved a life from solitude after losing his family to fever a decade past, moved through his days with quiet purpose, his hands busy with chores, but his mind wrestling with the weight of what he'd taken on. Saving Maribel, an Apache woman, and her daughters had been a choice that defied the whispers of his past, whispers that called her people savages, untrustworthy trouble. Yet each time he looked at Ayanna's gray eyes or heard Maribel's soft lullabies, those whispers grew fainter, drowned by something stronger, something he wasn't ready to name. Word traveled fast in the lowlands, carried by traders and trappers who spoke of the Apache woman who'd survived the blizzard, her pale child a marvel or a curse depending on who told the tale. Joseph Quinn, Maribel's husband, a man with one foot in the Apache world and one in the white man's, heard the news in a saloon, his face darkening with rage. To him, Maribel's survival was a slap to his pride, her daughters especially, Ayanna, the albino girl with eyes like storm clouds, a stain on his honor. He spread word through the plains, his voice thick with venom, claiming his wife had betrayed him, stolen his children, and shamed his blood. He rallied over 20 Apache warriors, their faces set with loyalty to their leader, their horses saddled for the ride up the mountain to reclaim what he called his. Silas was splitting wood outside the cabin when the hoofbeats came urgent and heavy, cutting through the morning mist. He set his axe down, his hand drifting to the knife at his belt, as Hattie, a wiry woman with a green shawl and a face lined by years of hard living, reined in her horse. Her breath fogged the air, her eyes sharp with warning. "Silas," she said, swinging down her boots, crunching the slush. "Joseph Quinn's coming. Got a war party 20 strong, maybe more. Says Maribel's his, says the girls are his blood. They're riding up tonight." Silas's jaw tightened, his gaze flicking to the cabin where Maribel was stirring a pot of broth, the girls' soft coos drifting through the open door. He'd known this day might come, had felt it in the way the wind shifted like a storm gathering strength. "He ain't taking them," he said, his voice low, steady, like a man stating the lay of the land. Hattie nodded, her face softening. "Sheriff Mathers with me and Tom Brody, that traitor Maribel patched up last month. They're waiting down the trail. Said they won't let a mother get dragged off like a thief." Silas gave a short nod, his mind already turning to the mountain, its ridges and hollows he knew like his own scars. He spent the day preparing, his hands moving with the calm of a man who'd faced death before and hadn't blinked. He rigged traps around the cabin ropes hidden under snow, ready to trip a horse, sharpened stakes buried in the dirt covered with brush. He propped crude figures of cloth and sticks in the tree line, their shapes vague in the dusk, like men lying in wait. He buried smoldering coals in shallow pits, their smoke curling up to suggest a camp of armed men. Every move was deliberate, his mind mapping the terrain as if it were a battlefield, his heart heavy with the knowledge that blood might spill before dawn. Maribel watched from the doorway, her scarf loose around her shoulders, Ayanna cradled in her arms. She didn't flinch at the news, didn't beg to run. Her eyes, once hollow with fear, now burned with something fiercer, something that had grown in the weeks since Silas pulled her from the snow. She stepped closer, her voice steady, though her hands trembled around her daughter. "If I have to die this time, Silas," she said, looking up at him, "at least my girls know their names." He met her gaze, his own eyes dark with a promise he didn't speak, and turned back to his work, the weight of her words settling into him like a stone. The night was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against the ears, heavy with waiting. Silas stood by the cabin door, his rifle leaning against the wall, his hands empty but ready. Maribel sat inside the girls, tucked close, their small breaths, a reminder of what was at stake. The fire burned low, its light casting long shadows across the room, and in that stillness, Silas felt the pull of her presence, not just as a woman he'd saved, but as someone who'd begun to fill the empty spaces he'd carried too long. Dawn broke over the Snowhorn Mountains with a mist so thick it clung to the pines like a shroud, blurring the line between earth and sky. Silas Granger stood in the clearing outside his cabin, his boots planted in the slush, his breath clouding in the cold air. The mountain was silent, save for the distant thud of hooves growing louder closer until the shapes of riders emerged from the fog. Over 20 Apache warriors, their faces painted with red and black streaks in the pattern of a coiled snake, rode up the ridge, their spears and rifles glinting in the weak light. At their head was Joseph Quinn, his broad frame draped in a bear hide, his eyes cold and sharp, like a blade honed for vengeance. He was no longer the man Maribel had married. He was a shadow of rage, his face a mask of pride twisted into hate. Silas stood alone, unarmed, his arms loose at his sides, his gaze steady as the riders reined in a dozen yards away. Maribel stepped out beside him, Ayana in her arms, Nita and Tallulah cradled against her chest in a sling of wool. The girls were quiet, their small faces tucked into their mother's warmth, but Ayana's gray eyes caught the light strange and unyielding. The air was thick with tension, the kind that hums before a storm breaks. Joseph swung down from his horse, his boots crunching the snow, his voice cutting through the mist. "Give me my wife and my children," he said, his words sharp as a whip. "They belong to me, to my blood." The warriors behind him shifted their hands, tightening on their weapons, but their eyes flickered with something less certain, something that wavered in the face of the woman before them. Maribel stepped forward, her head high, her scarf slipping to reveal the uneven stubble of her hair, a mark of her shame now worn like a badge. She held Ayana up, the girl's pale face glowing in the dawn. "They're not yours," she said, her voice calm, steady, like a river running deep. "They're mine, born of my heart, my pain. You gave them nothing but a name you don't deserve." The words hung in the air, heavy and true, and for a moment the warriors were still, their breaths visible in the cold. An old woman, her face lined like cracked earth, stepped forward from the group, her eyes sharp despite her age. She was Yaska, the midwife who'd delivered Maribel's girls, her hands stained with years of bringing life into the world. "This child," she said, pointing to Ayana, "is no curse. She's cold sun, a sign of change of hope. Our stories speak of her kind born to shift the path." Her voice was firm, carrying the weight of tradition, and the warriors murmured, their faces softening, their hands loosening on their weapons. The mist seemed to thicken, the smoke from Silas's hidden fires curling through the trees, the shadows of his decoy figures swaying like ghosts. The warriors glanced at one another, unease creeping into their ranks. Then from the tree line a new sound broke the silence, hooves steady and sure. Sheriff Mather rode into view, his badge glinting, flanked by Hattie and Tom Brody, the traitor whose fever Maribel had nursed away. Behind them were 3 townsfolk, their faces grim, their rifles ready. Mather held up a paper, its edges curling in the damp air. "Federal warrant," he called. "Any blood spilled here answers to the law." Joseph's face twisted, his hand hovering near his pistol, but the warriors behind him hesitated, their eyes darting between their leader and the woman who stood unbowed. A young warrior, barely more than a boy, spurred his horse forward, his voice sharp but uncertain. "If these are your daughters, Joseph," he said, "when did you ever hold them? When did you name them?" The question cut deeper than any blade, and Joseph's silence was an answer heavy and damning. The mist hung low, overwrapping the clearing in a hush that felt like the world holding its breath. Joseph Quinn stood alone now, his warrior's eyes no longer fixed on him, but on Maribel, who held her daughters close, her face calm but fierce, like a mother bear guarding her cubs. Silas Granger stood beside her, his frame solid as the ridge behind him, his hands empty, but his presence a wall no man could cross without paying a price. The smoke from his traps curled through the trees, the decoy figures swaying their shadows, playing tricks in the fog, making the mountains seem alive with unseen eyes. Joseph's face was a storm of rage, his hand gripping the pistol at his belt, his knuckles white. "You think you can steal what's mine?" he shouted, his voice cracking like dry wood. "You a white man, and her a traitor to her blood." Silas stepped forward, his boots crunching the snow, his eyes locked on Joseph's. "Shoot me then," he said, his voice low, steady, like the rumble of a distant avalanche. "If that's the only way you prove you're right." The warriors tensed, their hands tightening on spears and rifles, but none moved. Yaska, the old midwife, threw a red cloth to the ground, its color stark against the snow. "Enough," she said, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "This is not our way. We do not spill blood for a man's pride." The young warrior who'd spoken before nudged his horse forward, his face hard, but his eyes soft. "I won't kill a woman holding her child," he said, his voice carrying to the others. One by one, the warriors turned their horses, their hoofbeats muffled in the snow, their figures fading into the mist. Joseph stood alone, his shouts turning to curses, his eyes wild with the realization that his power had crumbled. Maribel sank to her knees, her arms wrapped around Ayana, Nita, and Tallulah, her tears falling not from fear, but from relief, from the weight of survival. Silas knelt beside her, his hand finding hers, his grip firm, not tentative like before, but certain, like a man claiming his place. "You're home," he said, the words simple but heavy, like stones laid to mark a path. She looked up, her eyes meeting his, and for the first time there was no shadow of hate or fear, only the quiet strength of two people who'd chosen each other against the world. The confrontation ended without blood, the mountain standing witness to a victory won not by bullets, but by courage, by the stubborn will to protect what mattered. Mather and the townsfolk stayed long enough to ensure Joseph's retreat, his figure vanishing into the snow, his threats empty against the tide that had turned. The warriors were gone, their loyalty to a man undone by the truth of a mother's love and a stranger's stand. As the mist cleared, Silas helped Maribel to her feet, her daughters still clinging to her, their small hands warm against her skin. The cabin stood behind them, its chimney trailing smoke, its walls a promise of safety. The fire inside burned low but steady, a reminder that life had been preserved not by force, but by those who refused to bow to fear, to hatred, to the past. Silas's hand lingered in Maribel's, not a gesture of possession, but of partnership, a silent vow that she was no longer alone, that this place, this ridge, was theirs. Spring settled over the ridges, softening the hard edges of winter with green shoots and the hum of bees drifting through wildflowers. Silas Granger's cabin, once a lonesome box of logs, where he'd nursed his grief for a decade now, stood as a haven, its walls weathered, but warm, its chimney trailing smoke like a quiet promise. Travelers, fur traders, ranch hands, weary souls chasing dreams, or running from ghosts, began to call it Hearth at Granger Ridge, a place where the fire was always lit, the stew always hot. Silas, his hands rough from years of splitting wood and skinning game, worked with a steadiness that hid the shift in his heart, the way Maribel and her 3 girls had cracked open the silence he'd carried since losing his wife and son. Ayana, Nita, and Tallulah filled the cabin with small noises, giggles, cries, the patter of tiny feet that felt like rain after a drought. Maribel moved through the days with a quiet strength, her hands no longer trembling as she stirred pots of venison stew or kneaded dough for cornbread, its golden crust a draw for hungry travelers. She'd taken to teaching, too, scratching letters on a slate for the children who wandered up the trail, their eyes wide with curiosity. Her voice, low and steady, carried Apache lullabies that hushed even the rowdiest, and folks began to linger not just for the food, but for the way she made the cabin feel like a home they'd forgotten. Silas watched her, his eyes catching the way she tucked a loose strand of hair under the wool scarf he'd given her, the way her fingers lingered on Ayana's pale cheek, or brushed Nita's curls. He didn't say much, never had, but each act of hers, each bowl of stew, each song felt like a stitch pulling his broken pieces together. The girls grew fast, their cheeks plump with milk and spring air, their cries turning to babbling songs that echoed their mothers. Ayana, with her moonlight skin and gray eyes, had a laugh that rang like a bell, drawing smiles from even the gruffest traders. Nita, quiet but watchful, clung to Maribel's skirts, her small hands reaching for the world with caution. Tallulah, bold and loud, toddled after Silas, her tiny voice calling him Pa, not with words, but with the way her eyes followed him, bright and trusting. Folks passing through would shake their heads, muttering, "If blood makes a family, this world's been cold too long." Silas heard them, felt the truth of it settle into him like a stone in a riverbed, heavy but right. He kept busy hunting rabbits and grouse, planting rows of potatoes and beans in a patch he'd cleared behind the cabin. He built small beds for the girls, sanding the wood smooth, his knife carving simple patterns that caught the firelight. The work was familiar, but the purpose was new, not just survival, but building something lasting, something for them. Maribel, in turn, patched quilts and wove baskets, her hands moving with the rhythm of her people, the Chiricahua Apache, whose ways she shared in quiet moments. She'd speak of the land's spirit of songs for daughters, and Silas would listen, his silence, not empty, but full, like the pause before a prayer. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the ridge in gold, Silas sat on the porch, a piece of red cloth in his hands. He'd traded a pelt for it at the trading post, spent nights stitching by the fire when Maribel slept, his fingers clumsy but determined. He'd embroidered 3 letters, A-N-T, for Ayana, Nita, and Tallulah, each stitch a promise he hadn't voiced. Maribel stepped out, her scarf loose, her eyes catching the glow of the dusk. He held out the shawl, his hands steady, but his heart uneven like a horse unsure of its footing. She took it, her fingers tracing the letters, and her breath caught tears spilling down her cheeks, not from sorrow, but from a joy so deep it hurt. She clutched the shawl to her chest, her lips curving into a smile that lit the porch brighter than the sunset. "You made this," she said, her voice soft, almost a whisper, like she was afraid to break the moment. Silas nodded, his throat tight. "For you," he said, the words plain, but heavy like stones laid to mark a home. They stood there, the air thick with unspoken things, and then she reached for his hand, her fingers warm against his calloused palm. They didn't speak of marriage, didn't call for a preacher. They just held hands before the hearth, the fire's glow wrapping them like a vow, their shadows blending on the wall. The girls slept in their beds, their small breaths a rhythm that bound them, and for Silas, the cabin was no longer a place to hide from the world, but a place to hold it close. The night stretched on the fire, burning steady, its light pushing back the dark. Maribel's hand stayed in his, her touch, not just a comfort, but a claim, a promise that they'd chosen each other, not because it was easy, but because it was true. Outside, the mountain hummed with spring, the wind soft, the stars blinking through the pines, and inside the hearth at Granger Ridge, burned with a fire that would never go out. Years passed, and the hearth at Granger Ridge grew from a cabin into a quiet legend, a place where the lost found rest, where the broken found a spark to keep going. The ridges around it bloomed with wildflowers, their colors bright against the dark pines, and the trail up the mountain wore smooth from the steps of travelers, traders, drifters, families chasing new starts. Silas Granger, his hair now streaked with gray, still moved with the quiet strength of a man who'd built a life from nothing. His hands still rough, but his heart softer, shaped by Maribel and the 3 girls who'd become his world. Maribel, her hair grown back in uneven waves under her scarf, carried herself with a grace that came from surviving the worst and choosing to live anyway. Her hands always busy, her voice always ready with a song or a story. The cabin had grown too, its east wall pushed out to make room for a bigger hearth, its shutters painted green with pigment, Maribel mixed from plants. Travelers came for her stew, venison thick with carrots, cornbread sweet with honey, and stayed for the warmth, not just of the fire, but of the family that called this place home. Maribel taught the children of the ridge not just her own, but the orphans and strays who walked miles for her lessons. She scratched letters on a blackboard Silas had carved from slate, teaching them to read and write, to shape words into poems that carried their dreams. Her voice, when she sang Apache lullabies, could hush a room, and folks would sit, mugs of pine tea in hand, their eyes soft with memories of homes they'd left behind. Ayana, Nita, and Tallulah were no longer babies, their legs now sturdy, their voices bright. Ayana, with her moonlight skin and gray eyes, ran through the yard, her laughter a melody that drew smiles from even the weariest travelers. Nita, still quiet, followed Maribel, her small hands learning to weave and stitch, her eyes sharp with thought. Tallulah, bold as ever, chased after Silas, her shouts echoing as she helped him carry wood or feed the horses. They'd learned their mother's songs, their voices blending in harmonies that floated through the pines, and when they looked at Silas, their eyes called him father, not with words, but with trust, with love that needed no blood to bind it. The stories of the ridge spread, carried by those who'd eaten at Maribel's table or slept under Silas's roof. They spoke of a man who'd faced down a war party to protect an Apache woman and her children, not with bullets, but with a heart that wouldn't bend. They told of Maribel Mother Snow, who'd turned pain into healing her hands, a bridge between worlds that once seemed too far apart. If you're lost in the snow, a trader would say, spitting tobacco into the dirt, look for the light at Granger Ridge. It'll lead you home. Each night as the sun sank and the stars rose, Silas and Maribel lit the hearth, not out of fear of the cold, but as a reminder of what they'd survived. The fire's glow caught the plaques above the girls' beds. Ayana, Nita, Tallulah, their names carved deep, a testament to a promise kept. The cabin filled with laughter, with the clatter of tin plates, with the soft hum of Maribel's songs, and travelers would leave with stories not written in books, but carried in their hearts, tales of a place where love had outlasted hate. One evening, as the girls played in the yard, their dresses stained with grass and joy, Silas sat on the porch, a basket of beans beside him, his hands snapping them with a rhythm that matched the dusk. Maribel stepped out, a mug of tea in her hand, and sat beside him, her shoulder brushing his. She handed him the mug, her fingers lingering on his, and they watched the girls chase fireflies, their laughter rising like sparks. "This fire we got," she said, her voice soft, like a secret shared with the night. It never went out. Silas looked at her, his eyes crinkling at the corners, a smile tugging at his lips. "Just needed a place to burn," he said, his words simple but heavy, like the weight of a life rebuilt. They sat there hand in hand as the sky turned lavender and the first stars blinked through the pines. The story of Silas and Maribel, of Ayana, Nita, and Tallulah wasn't written in any history book, but it lived in the ridge, in the fire, in the laughter that echoed through the mountains. It was a legend, not of heroes or wars, but of two people who'd chosen each other when walking away would have been easier, and in that choice, they'd built something that would never fade.